we started giving them, 600,000 international units of vitamin D to quickly elevate the vitamin D levels. It's a correcting dose, okay? It's not a toxic dose. Vitamin D is extremely safe. I would like to go ahead and say that to all your listeners.
Welcome back to Inspired Conversations, ladies and gentlemen. It's probably an overdue episode. It's well overdue. If you want to get some context around the conversation that I'm about to have with a very smart individual, then I do encourage you to check out my personal video and journey in the use of vitamin D to treat cluster headache. It's been one heck of a road since 2015. If you'd like this kind of content and the subject of vitamin D and the microbiome are of interest to you, then subscribe. There's going to be more to follow here. And I strongly encourage you to subscribe to my guest's podcast, and I'll announce his name in just a second. Suffice to say, team, I'm not a medical expert by any means. I just have a keen interest in the subject matter. And so it goes without saying, this doesn't constitute medical advice. Always talk to your doctor, but I hope we're able to garner and offer some insights into a topic that I say is incredibly dear and important to me. So what are we going to be talking about today? Vitamin D, gut health, microbiome, and overall health. And why am I interested in the topic? I'm coming from the perspective of someone that has used a range of supplements, including vitamin D, to maintain my 25 OH in a range of 80 to 100 nanograms per milliliter. And at that level, my cluster headache seems to stay away. It's been that way since 2015, by and large, coming up 10 years. Pain-free from cluster headache, and trying to understand how this could possibly be. One of the other questions that really drive my interest in the subject is that roughly about 80% of the people that suffer cluster headaches that try the vitamin D regimen find it has a therapeutic benefit. So what about the 20% or so that don't see a therapeutic benefit? What's possibly going on there? And I believe my guest today might be able to offer a new angle and some insights into that topic. So my interest in it led me to a protocol called Coimbra Protocol, and found folks using even high doses of vitamin D to treat autoimmune conditions like multiple sclerosis. I found doctors that had published books on the subject. Dr. Somerville, a keen fan of his vitamin D advocacy group. And then I stumbled across a presentation. It was called VDR Renewal Through Anti-Inflammatory Diet. I thought, hold on. This is something I want to check out. And I'm very, very glad that I did. It's a crying shame that this presentation has been viewed less than 1,000 times, because it is, as far as I'm concerned, on the bleeding edge of where this topic converges: vitamin D, microbiome, gut health. And so very few of the podcasts I've watched over the past 2 weeks, and I've watched a few, and they are heated. People talking about nutrition, these topics become incredibly heated with back and forth, veganism, carnivorism, but none of them are talking about vitamin D in relation to this topic. And so I'm excited to kind of add to the human hive mind and kind of the conglomerate of podcasts that are happening and converging on this topic to offer maybe a slightly different narrative and a different view into it. As with all my podcasts, I'll say it again, I'm not a medical expert. I've got no narrative to spin you. I just want to engage in a conversation, an inspired conversation. And as always, if I can help just one cluster headache sufferer, then as far as I'm concerned, team, I've absolutely done my job. That's me out of the way. My guest today, Dr. Eduardo Beltran Monasterio. He's a distinguished researcher and practitioner in integrative and functional medicine. He currently serves editor-in-chief of Targeted Medicine, the SPIMS And so that's the St. Patrick's Institute of Medical Science Journal of Medical Sciences. He is the creator of the LGS Protocol, which is a multidisciplinary approach for treating autoimmune diseases, metabolic syndrome, and cancer, as we will discover. He has a specialty in dermatology and internal medicine. He's also a vitamin D expert and author of 2 books. And I tell you what, this one I'm a little bit ashamed because the pages are well worn. There's dog because I fall asleep reading it, and it goes next to my bed, and then Ollie comes along, so there's a bit of dog here, and it's an incredibly good book. And other than that, my guest, Dr. Beltran, is just one heck of a genuine, caring, and incredibly smart individual. So welcome on the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here with you and being able to discuss a little bit of some microbiome, vitamin D. And well, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things today. And I'm really happy that you were able to actually see my book, read my book. I hope a lot of people down in New Zealand get the opportunity to be able to check it out as well. It sure has been a journey for me, as a physician and also as a researcher. Try to find answers, and I think we all, at some point in our life, we have doubts and questions that sometimes we don't seem to find answers, talking to colleagues and reading articles. And we kind of have to do our own research, and dive into the literature and do our own, investigation. And then it comes out to the end, we start having this moment where we say, Eureka, where a lot of things start to kind of fit in and make sense. And I guess you could say that my journey started when my son was diagnosed with autism a couple of years ago. And I saw all these doctors, all these pediatricians and neurologists and psychiatrists, and they were all, recommending, medications and certain therapies and therapists, and nobody was talking about the microbiome. No one was actually looking into vitamin D. I mean, these were things that I had to kind of stumble upon them as it was kind of like, as I was doing my own journey, in research here. And fortunately, I'm a physician, so I guess you could say I have a little bit of more of an advantage on to what other people, I guess, in the sense of being able to do research and kind of understand what's going on. And then I stumbled upon the microbiome and also the Coimbra Protocol, and that sort of kind of was the beginning of my journey, But initially started off with the Coimbra Protocol in Brazil. As you know, I am a physician, and I practice medicine in that country as well. And I guess what I could say is that it was a moment of a lot of revelation that was happening to me, and I saw a lot of patients who had what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms in relationship to their vitamin D genes. And then I started doing the research and getting into the literature, and I found that I was mind blown that practically 80%, close to 80% of all patients that have an autoimmune disease, they have a certain degree of genetic polymorphisms when it comes to their vitamin D genes. So then eventually I ended up, learning a little bit more about the microbiome. And the more I started to study how it actually functioned and how it was basically like the second brain, and there was like an intimate relationship with the brain and also with other organs as well, and it literally dictates on how our general health plays out. So that's how everything started off. And then I kind of like specialized in this field. I did a lot of research in regards to microbiome and how the microbiome affects the expression of vitamin D receptors, like you probably saw on my video that I have on my YouTube channel, where I put out a concept known as vitamin D receptor renewal through anti-inflammatory diet, and we were able to reproduce this, through immunofluorescence studies, with a colleague of mine, Dr. Fabiano Santos Guimarães from Brazil, where we literally were able to show that even though if you're a patient that's on high dose vitamin D therapy, right, doing the Coimbra Protocol, and you are also on kind of an anti-inflammatory diet, I guess you could say, without gluten, dairy, right, but you don't seem to show that. Let me say it this way: one of these patients just did not have the improvement that we were expecting, right? So eventually we said, well, you know what? Let's see what's going on in her microbiome. And then we were able to identify the presence of a fungus, known as Candida. So we decided to treat her. And as we treated her, we started to see improvement. But let me go ahead and back up a little bit over here, because this is where the interesting part is. So we suspected that the microbiome had something to do with the vitamin D receptors that were being expressed on those immune cells. So we decided to do a skin biopsy to be able to determine the amount of vitamin D receptors that were being expressed in the epidermis of the skin. And we found that there was a very low expression of vitamin D receptors prior to starting herbals. In this case, we used oregano oil and curcumin as well. But as the patient continued, and let me back up a little bit, she was on 50,000 international units of vitamin D, which was considerable, and as you probably know, one of the things that we do when we use the Coimbra Protocol is that we always compare our vitamin D levels with the parathyroid hormone, which is the antagonist hormone, right? And one of the main goals is to be able to inhibit the PTH hormone and elevate our vitamin D levels as much as we can. And when we see that there's an inhibition of the PTH levels, well, that's when we can say, okay, we've beaten the vitamin D resistance, right? So we eventually did a prior biopsy, an initial biopsy, and we saw that there was, through immunofluorescence, there was very little expression of vitamin D receptors. So we started, treating her with these antibiotics, antimicrobial herbs such as oregano oil, curcumin, also known as turmeric in some countries, right? And we started noticing a improvement, and we know for a fact that oregano oil is a very potent, antibiotic, and it kills a lot of things, not only bacteria, but also can kill funguses, and it's pretty darn good for killing candida. So she got much better after about almost 3 months. And then we repeated a second biopsy, and through immunofluorescence, we were able to see that the skin, it was just like, like the sky full of stars, so many vitamin D receptors were being expressed. And that just made so much sense, because when we correlated, her microbiome tests, and one of the markers that we could see there was calprotectin and also zonulin, which are, for the persons who are listening, these are intestinal health markers that we use to be able to determine the degree of leaky gut syndrome. We could see that there was an improvement in these intestinal health markers. So things started to make sense, and we say, whoa, wait a second. So actually treating the microbiome, modulating the microbiome through diet and herbals actually helps in reducing the excess amount of inflammation that you have in the gut. And this has a potential impact on how our immune cells, and let's not forget, 85% of our immune system, almost around 85% of our immune system, is located in the gut. So there's an intricate relationship between the microbiome with the immune system. And when we have too much leaky gut, these toxins that are coming in through the intestinal barrier, they interact with our immune cells and they downregulate these vitamin D receptors. So it's very, very important to be able to reduce the intestinal permeability as much as we can to allow our immune cells to be able to once again express our vitamin D receptors, and then hence allow the vitamin D metabolite to be able to bind to that receptor. So this is something that we were able to prove that contributes to also what we know as vitamin D resistance that's being generated by our gut dysbiosis.
Man, just in that explanation, there's a heck of a lot to kind of unpack, particularly for the person kind of moving into the space with not necessarily a grasp on some of those concepts. I wonder if it would be an appropriate time to share a slide with our audience, and it's perhaps the slide is a really good place to kind of start to say,
sure. So.
Or maybe if we just back up one step to say, well, the gastrointestinal tract, starting from the mouth and ending at the anus, really our conversation is centered around the large intestine, the colon, the gut.
Yeah, exactly. So in that slide that you're showing right there, We can see the gastrointestinal lining. We have those cells known as the enterocytes, which have the green coloration that you can see right there, and they're bound together with what we call tight junctions, right? Which are those purple boxes. And tight junctions are basically proteins that help bind these cells together to make sure that the gut isn't too permeable. I mean, we have to remember that the intestines, they have to be semi-permeable because they allow nutrients, vitamins, things that are going to be nutritious for our body, right? So it needs to be able to allow nutrients to get in, right? But now, let's not forget that in our gut microbiome, we have a whole bunch of these bacterias, funguses, viruses, parasites that live there, and they're living in symbiosis, which basically means that they live in harmony with us, right? And whenever you, for instance, consume certain foods, such as gluten, I guess you could say, that's a big one right there. That there's a lot of people that have issues with gluten, so gluten, once it gets in contact with these enterocytes, these green cells that you see right there, they have a lectin by the name of gliadin. Okay, so gliadin, once it gets uptaken by these enterocytes, they upregulate another protein by the name of zonulin. All right. And zonulin goes all the way to these tight junctions that are represented by the occludins and the claudins, and they break that bond. Okay. And when they break that bond, as you can see in the figure right beside, now the intestine that was initially, semi-permeable becomes now excessive, there's excessive permeability, which allows now for more bacteria to be able to, sink in, sneak in, I guess you could say, and also toxins. Let us not forget that bacteria have on their surface what we call lipopolysaccharides. These are the famous endotoxins, and these guys do a lot of damage. If we have a lot of exposure to them. As a matter of fact, it's one of the things that can even cause a fever. Because these are toxins that interact with your immune system, and they cause, the production of certain cytokines, right? So, in other words, what's going on here is that you have this increased permeability, which can be initially caused by exposure to certain types of foods. In this case, for instance, gluten, right, which upregulates zonulin, and zonulin is going to act upon the tight junctions, increasing the entrance of these bacterias, antigens, endotoxins, lipopolysaccharides, and sometimes might even have a fungus in there, and then you can even have the entrance of mycotoxins, right? So what we kind of have to remember is that your immune system, since it's mainly concentrated in the gut lining, right, around 80 to 85% of our immune system is there. The first line of defense of our immune system is always going to be the innate immune system, right? And here we can talk about, for instance, of our macrophages, dendritic cells, right? Neutrophils. And these are what we call antigen presenting cells. So whenever a toxin gets in contact with one of these cells are going to try to rapidly, try to eliminate this bacteria, the bad bacteria that's gotten in. They're going to do a process known as phagocytosis. I mean, these macrophages do that, right? And then they break it in little small chunks, and they present those pieces that have been digested by these cells, like the macrophages, and they present it to your acquired immune system, which would be represented by the T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, right? So it's kind of like saying, okay, you know what? I found this bacteria. He was sneaking in. I killed him. And now I'm going to go ahead and present him to you so you can be able to recognize what type of a pathogen this is and try to make an antibody later on down the road, right? So we make antibodies, and the cell that's responsible for making these antibodies are called our B cells, B lymphocytes. And when they mature, they become what we call plasmatic cells, right? So these plasma cells are the ones that are responsible for making antibodies. And let's say, for instance, you were consuming gluten, right? And a little bit of gluten got in, and now it's interacting with your immune system. So now these plasmatic cells are making antibodies, which are going to bind to the gluten molecule, gliadin in this case, and they're going to form what we call a immune complex. It's kind of like they're going to get together, they're going to surround that molecule, and they're going to try to eliminate it by forming these immune complexes, right? And once these immune complexes are formed, they take them all the way to the liver. And as we know, the liver is the laboratory of the human body where we detox everything, right? And get rid of these bad things right out of circulation. Now, the thing is that our immune system has what we call as immunologic tolerance, right? And what that means is that we can tolerate a certain amount of leaky gut and a certain amount of intestinal permeability, but to a certain extent. And for the listener who's watching this, try to imagine yourself that you're in a library and you're trying to read a book in silence, right? Try to focus, trying to understand what's written in those pages. And in the background, you have like two little kids that are just playing around, screaming and making a lot of noise, and then it starts to get a little bit annoying. So your tolerance in being able to focus is slowly getting worn down. And it gets to a point where you get a little bit upset, and then you might tell the kids, "Hey, get out of here!" So your immune system has what we call the immunologic tolerance. And when your immune system gets so overwhelmed with all of these toxins, these endotoxins, exotoxins, lipopolysaccharides, mycotoxins, there's going to be a moment where it's going to break. And when that breaks, hell gets loose, and what happens is that sometimes our immune system starts making these antibodies and they go haywire. And gluten, interestingly, has a sequence, an amino acid sequence that sometimes resembles a lot of endogenous proteins that are found in different tissues in our body. And whenever you have this protein that gets in and you produce an antibody to try to be able to neutralize it, something can happen known as molecular mimicry. And unfortunately, this can happen to a lot of patients who have autoimmune disease. This is the mechanism by which the pathogenesis by how autoimmune diseases take place is you eventually end up making these antibodies where you recognize this gluten. And then unfortunately, that gluten has a protein structure that's similar to a protein that's also, for instance, found in the thyroid, right? So this same antibody, now when it's circulating around the body and it reaches all the way to the thyroid, it says, "Hey, wait a second, you kind of look like gluten, I think since you're kind of similar to him, I'm going to start attacking you." And then all of a sudden you start developing what we know as, Hashimoto's disease, which is a hypothyroidism, right? Or you can have the contrary, which is hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease. Or if it goes all the way to the skin, you can probably cause psoriasis. Or it can cause, if it affects the melanocytes, which are the cells that give pigmentation to the skin, can cause vitiligo. You start targeting those cells there, right? And if it goes to the central nervous system, well, then you can have brain fog, you can have Parkinson, you can have Alzheimer's, you can have a whole bunch of neurodegenerative diseases that can start manifesting, and including also cluster headaches, you see? So there's an intricate relationship between our gut microbiome with the rest of the body. Everything's related to the gut microbiome. I always have a saying that the microbiome is the epicenter of human health, right? And if you want to improve your general health, you got to start with your gut. That's the first starting point.
Love it. And so I could just take the advice of Jordan Peterson, then Dr. Beltran. I'm interested to understand what some of those bacteria living in my colon might think of that decision. And that's an element, I guess, that is seldom discussed when these proponents are kind of arguing back and forth. It seems to me many of the bacteria that live in the colon like to ferment stuff. And what do they like to ferment? When you read the literature, they want to ferment fiber, plant fiber. And so I just want to understand, what are the benefits of allowing and feeding the bugs what they're looking for in terms of that reciprocal, I guess, arrangement. Like you could even talk about some of the, and I've heard you talk about Akkermansia multifila. I mean,
Yeah.
You kind of look at what that critter does. He's actually eating away this blue stuff that's separating out the enterocytes from the actual microbiome. So, man, it sounds like you would want to get rid of him really quick. Or is that part of just that beautiful symbiosis in terms of a relationship?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And that's actually one of my specialties right there. I'm gonna try to break it down as nicely possible, make it understandable so people can relate to it. So when we talk about the microbiome, well, the first thing, the microbiome in general, the word microbiome refers to a very big, large group of microorganisms. And here we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about funguses, we're talking about parasites, we're talking about archaeas, which are very ancient primitive forms of bacteria. And we're also talking about viruses. So we have all of these things that live in us, right? And if we look at the literature, it says that the human body has approximately around 32 trillion cells, but our microbiome is represented by approximately close to 100 trillion. So we're more microbes than human cells in general, you know. That's kind of mind-blowing. And if you were to put all of these guys on a balance to be able to weight them out, it would be close to about 2 kilos. So it's pretty considerable, you know. And we have to remember that these guys they're there for a reason, and that we live in symbiosis, like you said. You know, I mean, we have to coexist, and we give them the food because when we eat, we're actually feeding them as well. And as you had mentioned, you know, fiber is one of those things that we give these guys, right? But they also make a lot of important things for us. You know, they help break down certain foods. They absorb certain nutrients. They help make certain vitamins, such as vitamin B12, folate, vitamin K. You know, I mean, just to give you an idea, lactobacillus, for instance, bifidobacterium, aerobacterium, these guys make vitamin B9, right? There's another bacteria, for instance, that makes propionbacterium, for instance, and lactobacillus can make vitamin B12, which is known as, cobalamin. And then we have Bacteroides fragilis, which makes vitamin K. So, I mean, these bacteria are actually making vitamins for us, which are very important. And as we know, our body doesn't make vitamin K. We rely on these guys. So it's important for us to make sure that these guys are in check, you know, because sometimes we will find ourselves in a certain state of deficiency. And if you're not making, for instance, enough amounts of vitamin K, we know that vitamin K is important for coagulation, for instance, right? And if you don't have enough vitamin K being made by your gut, well, you'll have issues with bleeding. And it goes down that rabbit hole, I guess you could say, if you want to keep on going in there. You know, but in general, we are living in symbiosis, just like you said, and they're making stuff for us, and we benefit from those things. And one of those things that these bacteria make when they receive, for instance, fiber, they ferment fiber and they convert it into what we call small chain fatty acids, right? And these fatty acids, the ones that have been most studied, at least in the literature, are propionate, you know, acetate, butyrate. Butyrate is like the big one, you know. But these bacteria are making all of these, you know, small chain fatty acids, which are very, very important for the body. For instance, you know, propionate is very important for a process known as gluconeogenesis. It means the making of new sugar, right? It also protects us against, you know, insulin resistance. It also regulates appetite, you know, GLP-1, the famous Ozempic that we got over there, you know, and we can also talk about that with akkermansia. It also has certain anti-inflammatory effects. It inhibits the making of certain cholesterol. So it's also important, for instance, for gut motility, and that's just propionate. Acetate, you know, is a very important energy source for bacteria. And there's a phenomenon by which we call cross feeding, which means some bacteria receive the fiber and they make acetate, right? In this case, we're talking about a bacteria by the name of bifidobacterium. A lot of people have probably taken bifidobacterium as a probiotic. You know, it's a very, very common probiotic. So bifidobacteria consumes acetate, and it consumes fiber, excuse me, and it converts it into acetate, right? And then acetate is going to feed other bacteria to be able to make butyrate. So this is what we call cross feeding, right? And interestingly, if you are one of those individuals who likes to, you know, drink a little bit of vinegar, you know, vinegar is, you know, acetic acid. Once it hits the stomach, the hydrochloric acid of the stomach converts that into acetate. And acetate, is one of those things that's going to be able to feed your good bacteria. So that's kind of interesting. And that's why there's certain benefits when you consume a little bit of vinegar, and you're in the morning. Let's say if you wake up early in the morning, have like a little spoon of vinegar. I know not everybody's going to do that. I don't do that on a daily basis. My wife does that, but it's one of those things that keeps you in check. It keeps your microbiome in check. And these bacteria, they're always intercommunicating with themselves. So they make certain metabolites, certain small chain fatty acids, which are going to be able to feed other bacteria. And here's where butyrate comes in, which is like the one of the most important, small chain fatty acids. Butyrate supports the colonocytes, which are the bacteria that the cells that live in our large intestine, right? The enterocytes are the cells that are found, for instance, in our small intestine, and the colonocytes are the cells that are found in our large intestine, right? And so whenever there's a cell that might be a little bit, damaged, what butyrate goes over, it tells the cell, hey, die. We want you to die, and we want a new cell to come up, to be able to replace the dead one, right? So it's always helping the gut lining, the intestinal lining, to be able to replenish those cells that are wounded, perhaps cells that perhaps might kind of be mutating, becoming like a cancer cell. So butyrate is very important for being able to protect us, from a process known as cancer, developing cancer. Also, butyrate downregulates a pro-inflammatory pathway by the name of NF-kappa B, and that's a shared common pathway with lipopolysaccharides, which are endotoxins that are found in from bacteria, right? It's a very potent immune regulator, an immune modulator. It helps regulate the production of Treg cells, T regulatory cells, interleukin 10, which are anti-inflammatory. So believe it or not, your small chain fatty acids that are made by your gut bacteria, they're helping to, train your immune system to a certain extent. Kind of like, telling these guys, hey, you know what? You're supposed to be able to know when to recognize a bad bacteria and when you're not supposed to overreact, right? And it also allows your immune system to kind of like stay in this anti-inflammatory state. And then, like I said, it also has a neuroprotective benefit as well. But what I like people to understand is that in order for these good bacteria, and don't get me wrong, we also have a lot of bad bacteria in our intestines, okay? And they're there, they live, coexist as well, but in harmony, right? And the thing is that you always have to try to make sure that everything is in balance, and you don't have an overgrowth of one thing or a lacking of another thing, right? And when that unfortunately, the type of diet that we have, I mean, we consume a lot of sugars, refined carbohydrates. I could go on talking about, the Western diet. I mean, there's nothing good to talk about it actually, but unless if you're going to talk a little bit about, in the Mediterranean diet, where you actually start seeing that it's one of the best diets that you have out there, right? Or, a lectin-free diet with no gluten, no dairy. Well, I mean, that's another topic to talk about. But what's important to understand is that diet has a humongous impact on how these good bacteria start to replicate and start making all of these small chain fatty acids, such as propionate, such as acetate, and such as butyrate. And whenever we take an antibiotic, for instance, right? And let's say we went to the doctor, we had like strep throat, or we have acne. There's a lot of teenagers that go to the doctor because they have acne on their face. And one of the things that a dermatologist will do is prescribe an antibiotic, such as, minocycline or tetracycline. And we know that you have to take this for a long, extended period of time to be able to control the acne, right? But the problem is that you can be taking these antibiotics, and they can actually improve the acne that you have in your skin, but they're killing off the good bacteria. And when you take out these good guys, now all of a sudden the bad bacteria start to overgrow, right? And believe me, all teenagers, at least if I know, they eat everything, They love to consume carbohydrates. They're going to McDonald's, they're going to Wendy's. I mean, they're going to be eating, okay, pizza and all these things, and Coke and Coca-Cola, Sprite, whatever. So they're putting massive loads of sugar into their diet. And what these bacteria love is sugar. I mean, they thrive on sugar, right? And they can be in the form of sugar, they can be in the form of carbohydrates, processed carbohydrates, and they start growing. So all of a sudden now, the antibiotic that was used to be able to treat the acne killed off the good bacteria and now allows for the bad bacteria to start overgrowing. And then you can actually develop what we call dysbiosis, which basically means the imbalance of our gut microbiome, where there's a higher prevalence or overgrowth of bad bacteria over good bacteria. And this ends up causing a lot of localized inflammation in the gut. And eventually, there's going to get to a point where you're going to start increasing the permeability of the gut lining. And there's going to be more interaction of your immune system with the microbiome, and perhaps even certain proteins, bad digestive particles that are coming from your diet, which shouldn't be interacting with your immune system in the first place. And there's going to be a moment where your immune tolerance is going to get overwhelmed. And eventually, once that immune tolerance is overwhelmed, you might develop a molecular mimicry and end up developing a autoimmune disease, right? Going back to what we would mention before, right? So there's a lot of things that happen in the microbiome. And what we have to understand is that 90% of our microbiome is found in our large intestine. 10% is found in the small intestine, but 90% is found in the large intestine. And if we look at the large intestine where that 90% is found, 90% of that 90% is represented by two bacterial phylas. So when we look at bacteria, they're classified according to their phyla. Then eventually there's the kingdom, the phyla, until we reach to the species, right? So there's a classification of families. And the biggest main phyla that we have here is one of them that you just mentioned, which is Firmicutes, and the other one, which is Bacteroidetes. So these guys represent 90% of the 100%, okay, of the microbiome. But then we have other groups as well that are very important, and these guys also have, a very important role, in our microbiome. And here we can mention, for instance, the actinobacteria, where we can mention bifidobacteria. We can also mention proteobacteria, where we have all the bad guys. That's like going, try to imagine that you have the microbiome and you have different neighborhoods. You have the very nice elite, the good guys, very, very nice places to go visit. But then you have, the neighborhoods where nobody wants to go around because of high violence. The bad guys are there, So those are the protobacteria, we don't want to be messing around with them very much,
But it sounds to me like you'll always have those bad neighborhoods in a city, for example.
Of course.
The same with the microbiome. So am I right in understanding then, like a microbiome or a gut that's in, and I think the term is eubiosis. So there's balance to it. As a gut where, and you could talk a little bit more about the mucosal guardian or that mucin, because there's a relationship there between short chain fatty acids and mucin, and
there sure is.
Kind of, I mean, it looks to me like you need to swim through the mucin before you can have a wrestle match with the colonocyte to be able to get through anyway. So
that's right. So we have exactly, yes, Craig, you're 100% correct. We have this mucus layer known as the mucin layer that separates our microbiome from interacting directly with our immune cells, right? And this mucin layer is made thanks to the production of these small chain fatty acids and, of course, certain vitamins and minerals. And one of the vitamins, obviously, is vitamin D. Vitamin D promotes also the production of mucin. And you kind of have to think about it this way. This is how I always explain it to my patients: is that I want you to let me go ahead and show you. For instance, I'm showing here this is the charger that I have for my iPhone, right? and I can actually touch it, and it's connected to the wall. I'm not getting electrocuted or anything. It's because it's got a protection outside of it. It has a specific barrier that isolates me for not being electrocuted, right? So the mucous membrane that we have out there in our gut lining, known as the mucin layer, separates and protects us, for not having that direct interaction between the microbiome with your immune system. And what feeds off, these cells that make the mucin layer, they're called the goblet cells. These cells are also found in our gut. And these goblet cells, they make mucin, right? And it's thanks to the presence of these small chain fatty acids, right? Now, when you start losing these good bacteria, then what happens is that if you don't make enough small chain fatty acids, right? And if you have certain vitamin deficiencies and certain minerals deficiencies, such as zinc, vitamin D, you name it, then you start losing this mucous membrane, this mucin layer, and it starts to thin out. And what we really want, we really want to have a nice thick mucin layer, because the thicker it is, the less interaction you're going to be having between your microbiome with the immune system. But what happens is that our diet changes. We might be exposed to antibiotics. We might be exposed to many different things that might affect our microbiome diversity. So we start producing less small chain fatty acids. And then we start getting this thinning out of this mucin layer, right? And then when there's very little mucin, and here's where we're going to talk about Akkermansia, because Akkermansia has a very important role in the recycling of the mucin layer. Okay, this is a bacteria that's there to be able to recycle and clean up that mucin. Okay, you kind of have to imagine like this is the guy that's always cleaning up the mess. All right, by eating up the mucin, right? So if you have, this mucus that's there, and it's not being replenished and it's not being, recycled, you start building up a lot of garbage on it, right? And then these things, they start to build up, and it gets like the environment doesn't get very healthy at all. So Akkermansia has the main role of being able to eat up and recycle that mucus, right? Making new mucus as well, because it also promotes the production of certain small chain fatty acids to be able to replenish that mucus layer. So it has these two functions, right? One is it participates in the cleaning, and the other is in the remaking, right? Now, it's interesting to say something here, because as we age, one of the things that I generally see when I do a lot of microbiome testing is that a lot of individuals don't have Akkermansia in their gut. Okay. And that might be to many different factors, but that tells me that your mucin layer is compromised. Okay. Or you might actually have an overgrowth of Akkermansia. And that has also been described in medical literature. And that's a sign of inflammation. Why? Because the gut also tries to make mucin on its own whenever there's inflammation. I kind of imagine this. Whenever you get a cold, right? Let's say you got a viral infection, a respiratory tract infection. Why is it that we make mucus? Why is it that we start making all this mucus? Why is it that we start, all we have, our noses get all full of snot and stuff, it's because we're making all this mucus to be able to eliminate, the infection, right? So whenever you make too much mucus, right, then you're overfeeding Akkermansia, and Akkermansia starts to build up. So that's another reason why Akkermansia can overgrow in the microbiome. So that's kind of interesting, right? So our microbiome, as you can see, it's very, very it's a universe, when you start looking at
It's a very complex ecosystem.
Yes.
While you're talking, someone had messaged me within the Cluster Headache community, and they had taken a GI map, and they were following a real strict carnivore diet. So no sugar, dairy, gluten, lectins, none of that. In fact, nothing apart from minced beef, or just
Right.
eating
Yeah.
animal protein. And they had seen significant improvement in a number of conditions in their health. However, the GI map did show that they had an overgrowth of C. diff, as well as a heightened marker for intestinal permeability, zonulin.
Yeah.
I guess just with that in mind, why do people see some improvement on the carnivore diet? Because now I'm perplexed to say, how could it even work when these bugs that we've just talked about want the fiber to be able to ferment it, produce the short chain fatty acids that then encourage the production of the mucin that provides the barrier that prevents kind of that first line of defense before there's an interaction with the microbiome, the food waste, the toxins, the endotoxins, all of that stuff that's going to lead to the degradation of the tight
Oh,
junctions.
yeah. Definitely, definitely. There's a very good explanation to that. There's a great explanation why people go carnivore, and you just, yes, definitely, you see significant improvement, and people start saying, wow, my psoriasis went away, my vitiligo improved, my multiple sclerosis got better. And there's multiple reasons for that. It's not so simple, but I'm going to go ahead and break it down. Okay. So what happens is this: whenever you consume certain plant-based diets, right, you're consuming a lot of things that have been exposed to herbicides, insecticides. I mean, glyphosate, for instance, is, oh my God, it's an antibiotic to begin with. It has a patent of an antibiotic. Back in 1996, Monsanto, when it launched, glyphosate, it had a patent of an antibiotic, So imagine you're actually putting a herbicide on all of these crops. And we know that it's also oncogenic, so it can actually promote cancer, right? And it also destroys your tight junctions, by the way. So, and it's also an antibiotic that's going to kill your good bacteria. So there's a lot of damage that's being done just by the fact that you're consuming food that's been, irrigated, with glyphosate. Okay. And I don't know how it is in your country, but I mean, in South America and the United States, I mean, glyphosate is all over. I know that some certain European countries, it's prohibited; they don't allow glyphosate, right? And that's good. I think it should be that way. But so just the fact that you're consuming foods that have herbicides is a no good. Okay, it's terrible, right? Now let's go into the lectins. Let's talk about the lectins. Thing is that a lot of these plants, I mean, they've been around for a long, long time, even before humans actually ever existed. When God created the world, he made the trees and the vegetables and all these things first before we were actually walking around, it's in Genesis, just look it up. So these guys have been long before us, okay? And they've developed, many different lectins to be able to protect themselves, to defend themselves, right? So if an
Well, I
animal
guess
would
they
go,
can't run away, right? A plant can't
exactly,
just
they
go.
can't run away, so they needed to be able to defend themselves somehow, right? And that's why they develop toxins, and these toxins are the famous lectins, right? And we consume these lectins on a daily basis, And then there's going to get to a point where you start having dysbiosis like Clostridium difficile or H. pylori or Pseudomonas or Morganella. And you start getting all these bad bugs because you were exposed to all these things prior in your life and perhaps even antibiotics. So you need to ask those questions to the patient. Hey, have you taken antibiotics? When was the last time you took them? Oh, yes, I did. I had loads of issues with, my tonsils all the time. I had to have my tonsils taken out because they were always getting infected. And I always had to take, penicillin to be able to treat my tonsils, my strep throat. And then you say, okay, and what about vitamin D? How were your levels of vitamin D? How was your immune system? That whenever I hear a person that's always having recurrent, respiratory tract infections, sinusitis, amygdalitis or tonsillitis, upper respiratory tract infections, pneumonia, I immediately start relating that to immune system, a weak immune system, right? And perhaps maybe something related with vitamin D. But don't forget, we are always exposed, right, to antibiotics at one point in life, right? And unfortunately, these antibiotics can have a very large toll on our microbiome. And as I was saying a little bit earlier for this, the example that I gave you about, acne, you can get the acne, cured, and then 10 years down the road, you develop Crohn's disease. And then you're wondering why, you see? is because 10 years ago, you took so many antibiotics that you allowed for Clostridium difficile or Escherichia coli, right, to be able to overgrow. And now it starts causing all this inflammation in your intestines. And you, under the presence of a vitamin D, of a low vitamin D state, right, and you have a certain epigenetic risk to certain diseases, you set the stage for the disease to show and manifest. Now, when you go on a carnivore diet, what are you doing? You're eliminating these lectins. You're taking out the glyphosate, you're taking out the herbicides, you're taking out anything that can potentially cause food sensitivity or increase permeability, right? And then you're just left with fat and protein. Now, these bacteria that we have in our gut, they know what to do with carbohydrates. They love carbohydrates. They specialized in carbohydrates, right? They ferment carbohydrates. They use it as a fuel source. So whenever you put in sugar or in a carb, they're dancing and they're partying. They're doing everything they want. But the moment you put in, fat, they look at it and it's like, what the heck is this? I don't know what this is. What are we going to do with this? Everybody's like looking at each other. What's this? And they don't do anything with fat. I mean, I'm talking about healthy fats, obviously, right? And then when they look at protein, they kind of look at it, oh, well, I guess I know what I can do with it, but they're not very efficient with protein, breaking down protein. They can use protein, but not as well as carbohydrates. So this is why when you go on a carnivore diet, you start improving your gut health to a point where symptoms get better. But if you do a GI map and then you discover, oh, wait a second, you actually have Clostridium difficile. You actually have this other, you're actually revealing what was there in the first place. And then that's when you go in with the herbals to be able to eradicate those infections. And then that's when you improve everything. See? And people are not aware of these things.
Yes. It kind of segues us into, I guess, our the next segment to say, it seems to me, it was 2,000 years ago or so that Hippocrates had said it all begins in the gut, but now we're kind of coming full circle with the slide, with the kind of the slide in front of us to say, okay, dysbiosis results in a mucin layer that's degraded. There's interaction with the contents of the gut with the lining, and a degradation of the tight junctions, allowing those endotoxins, mycotoxins, exotoxins, to then start entering and have a tiffy, if you will, with the immune system, and probably why you say 85% of the immune system's on the other side of that wall, ready to go bang, hello.
That's right.
So talk to me about how the brain gets involved in all of this in terms of, I've heard terms like the gut-brain immune axis.
Oh, yeah. Well, the brain, and the gut, they have this huge connections. I mean, oh my goodness, if you were to look at how the immune system participates directly with, your gut microbiome participates directly with the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system. It's incredible because the human brain has approximately 86 billion neurons, right? That's how many neurons we have. And the gut has approximately, the enteric nervous system has approximately 50 million neurons. So it's a very high concentration of neurons there. And we also have the vagus nerve. So we have two lines of interconnection between the gut and the brain, okay? And 90% of all those afferent pathways go from the gut to the brain. So there's 95% of all those connections are coming from the gut to the brain, and 10% are coming from the brain to the gut. So that's kind of impressive, So this means the gut is telling our brain a lot, and the brain says, okay, I'll send in, an impulse to be able to produce more hydrochloric acid. I'll send an impulse to increase motility. They're constantly interacting, right? And we kind of forget that the gastrointestinal tract is extremely innervated, and the vagus nerve is so here's the thing we have to kind of understand, back up a little bit, because when we look at the nervous system, right, we have what we call the central nervous system and we also have the peripheral nervous system, right? The central nervous system is represented by the cranial nerves, okay? These are nerves that are coming out of the brain, and they're going to the eyeball, to the lung, to the stomach, to different parts of our body, right? Okay, but then we have the peripheral nervous system, okay, which are coming out from the spinal cord, and these are going to our muscles. We have motor nerves, we have sensory nerves, and part of that is also going to our gut, our intestines, our kidneys, our liver, our bladder. I mean, these nerves form part of the peripheral nervous system. And the enteric nervous system is part of that, okay? So we have two nervous systems that are communicating with the brain. One is the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, and the enteric nervous system, okay? And when we look at the pathways, the amount of neurons that are being shared, 90% of those neurons are ascending neurons, which means they go from the gut to the brain, and 10% are descending, which comes from the brain to the gut. So a lot of messaging comes from the gut and goes to the brain. That's what I'm trying to say, you see? And we're talking about around 500 million neurons here, right? So that's a lot. But as I was saying, a little bit earlier, the gut itself, whenever you have this dysbiosis, whenever you are consuming certain foods that are causing a lot of inflammation, right? And you stop producing small chain fatty acids in adequate amounts, and then all of a sudden you start making a lot of these inflammatory markers. A lot of these endotoxins start leaking in, and they start interacting with what we call your immune system, right? And one of the things that we notice is that these endotoxins, specifically, I like to talk about the lipopolysaccharides, because these guys, oh boy, they do a lot of damage in our body. Okay. Once they get leaking in, once they start getting in and interacting with your immune system, like I said, they interact initially with your antigen presenting cell, as you can see in the slide right there, right? And they bind to what we call toll-like receptors, right? And also CD15 receptors. And also, they inhibit the vitamin D receptor expression. So in other words, they upregulate production of certain interleukins and cytokines, and these interleukins that we make, one of them is interleukin 1, interleukin 6. These two interleukins, by the way, when we make massive amounts of loads of them, they cause fever, all right? So interleukin 1 and interleukin 6, when it gets to the hypothalamus, it causes shivers, it causes fever, increases your heart rate, increases blood flow. And the reason why is because we want to quickly, make those neutrophils make their way where the site of the infection is. And I want to put little things in perspective here. I want you to imagine a patient who has Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, also which enters within the realm of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, right? So let's say we have a patient that has Clostridium difficile, right? And he has an overgrowth of Clostridium difficile. And if you're a patient who has Crohn's disease, you start developing these ulcers in your large intestine. And it can actually get to a point where these ulcers are so massive, they start to bleed. And if you do a GI map, or if you look at the feces, you'll actually see the presence of blood. And in some instances, you actually end up going to the emergency room, and they have to do a hemicolectomy, take a chunk out of your intestines, because it's so it's gone so far in, that they can't recuperate that tissue. So they have to kind of like cut it out and join it back together, It's that bad, And I've had patients who had Crohn's disease where they lost like 2 meters of their intestines, because they were, with the excessive amounts of dysbiosis, and they were just making so many inflammatory markers that it made their immune system go haywire. And the first line of defense are the neutrophils. So when neutrophils get to the gut lining, right, one of the things that these guys do which is something very interesting, is that they produce a protein known as calprotectin, okay? And calprotectin is a protein that sequesters manganese, right? And also zinc. So when it sequesters these two minerals, it doesn't allow for these bacteria to continue to proliferate, continue to grow. It kind of is like, you're taking away the food resource that they require in order for them to be able to continue to grow. So it kind of, your body's trying to keep, the infection, to a certain degree where it doesn't continue to progress. But like I said, we all have a certain point where we're going to end. If it's like muscle, you're arm wrestling, with these guys, and then there's going to a point where you get tired, and then all of a sudden you lose. And but like I said, in the gut, we also have what we call the tight junctions. And these tight junctions, once they get compromised, now these lipopolysaccharides make their way into the immune system. They make their way into the blood circulatory system, and they get all the way to the brain. And in the brain, we have what we call the blood-brain barrier, right? Which also has tight junctions, just like in the gut. And now, if these lipopolysaccharides are arriving to the gut, are arriving to the brain, they start affecting those tight junctions that you have, within the blood vessels, right? Which are known as endothelial cells. And these tight junctions break up. And now you start having this entrance of these lipopolysaccharides into the central nervous system, into the brain. And obviously, there was a study that was done in the past where they were trying to look at the brain of autistic children, for instance, and I mentioned this in my book, where they were doing this study, trying to see what was going on in the brain of these autistic children. The pathologist was doing this, and he was able to determine that there were the presence of certain immune cells that shouldn't be there, and they were making these immune clusters of immune cells, of neutrophils, inflammatory antigen-presenting cells that were found in the brain of autistic children. And what does this mean? It means that autism, in essence, is a neuroinflammatory condition caused by leaky brain. And if you have leaky brain syndrome, you also have leaky gut syndrome, right?
So you then come back to the slide and say
exactly
the originator. And so this is a second version of that same slide we were kind of just looking at to say.
So that's another beautiful slide right there, because these lipopolysaccharides, they do a lot of things, right? One of the things that they do is that your body is always trying to, maintain everything, under control. Okay. And your liver is working in favor. It's trying to do the job it's supposed to be doing, which is, eliminate these toxins, right? Okay. So whenever you have an increase of lipopolysaccharides, your liver starts making what we call lipoproteins, okay? And here we can mention high-density lipids, low-density lipids, very low-density lipids, LDL, HDL, right, VLDL. And these guys go and they bind to these endotoxins, these lipopolysaccharides. And we also make another protein known as the lipopolysaccharide binding protein, also known as LPB, right? And it binds, and they make this complex to be able to eliminate that toxin via the hepatic route. So let's say if we have leaky gut and these toxins are making their way in, your liver is going to say, oh, wait a second, we have a lot of toxins. We need to do a lot of cleansing here. We need to be able to clean out these endotoxemia. We need to reduce the excess amount of lipopolysaccharides. So it starts making more of these lipoproteins, HDL, LDL, VLDL. But it gets to a point, for instance, this is something that I used to see in my patients that I saw in the intensive care unit, because before I got into dermatology, I was an internist. I also have a subspecialty in intensive care unit treatment of patients, and I saw a lot of septic patients. And one of the things that I would always see is that their lipid profile would always be very altered. And that got me going, well, why is it that these lipids are getting elevated? Why do these patients have an altered lipid profile? And the reason why is because your liver is, trying to save you by trying to eliminate the excess amount of lipopolysaccharides that are circulating in the body. And don't forget, these lipopolysaccharides, they cause vasodilation. They cause, a decrease in the blood pressure. This is one of the characteristics of the patient that's in the intensive care unit. They have low blood pressure, and we need to be giving them, vasopressors, to be able to increase their blood pressure. Because when you have sepsis, you have so many of these bacteria in the blood that are loading the system with lipopolysaccharides, increasing the vasodilation, increasing permeability, and now you start having this extravasation of fluid into the tissues and start getting edema, right, in the lower extremities. And this can eventually lead to, multi-system organ failure. And that's one of the, things that we see in patients that are in the intensive care unit. So there's a whole pathophysiology. If you don't take care of yourself, you don't have the infection under control, all of these things start to play out. And the liver plays part of that process there, So your immune system is trying to defend you. Your liver is trying to detox you, and if you don't have vitamin D levels in adequate amounts, well, you're going to be in trouble because your immune system is going to go haywire. It's not going to be able to defend you correctly how it's supposed to, right? So that's what the slide there is trying to show you. If I can kind of recap real quick. So here we can see the lipopolysaccharide. It's binding to the antigen-presenting cell. It produces all of these interleukins, like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, tumor necrotic factor alpha, right? It goes to the hypothalamus, causes fever, increases your heart rate as tachycardia as a compensatory effect, increases blood flow, taking these neutrophils to the site of the infection. But at the same time, you also cause vasodilation, right? Because you're producing a lot of nitric oxide. And then this increases the permeability of the blood vessels. And when you have an increase of the permeability of the blood vessels, now you don't only just have hypotension, but you have leaking of plasma into the interstitial fluid, and that can cause renal failure, lung failure. It can cause, edema, and eventually you end up having, which is the multi-system organ failure. And this is known as septicemia, septic shock, right? So lipopolysaccharides can be very damaging if you don't have them under control, right? But I don't know if you want to show the next slide, perhaps, maybe. That's a little bit what we were talking about at the beginning. We were talking about how lipopolysaccharides, they have this affinity for binding to specific receptors, such as the toll-like receptors. And when they bind to this receptor, they upregulate a pathway where they make a lot of NF-kappa B. And this pro-inflammatory molecule, NF-kappa B, increases interleukin 1 beta and tumor necrotic factor alpha, which, in other words, decreases transcription, inhibits transcription, inhibits translation, and there is no expression of the vitamin D receptor, right? So if you don't have expression now of these vitamin D receptors in those immune cells, so what's going to happen with vitamin D? It's not going to be able to bind to it. It's not going to be able to act at that vitamin D receptor to form what we know as the vitamin D receptor complex, right? And we know, but when we form these vitamin D receptor complex, we upregulate transcription, we upregulate translation, we make enzymes, we make proteins, we do what the body was meant to do, right? Normal physiology. But now these bacteria, these endotoxins or mycotoxins can do the same thing. They're putting your immune system to a halt where they're taking over, you see? And that's not a good thing, because besides this, there's also another thing that that's going to be described in my 5th edition, my next book that's coming out, which has been it's been revised, that also lipopolysaccharides, they inhibit the expression of certain genes that are part of the conversion of vitamin D. For instance, we know that vitamin D, when we expose ourselves to the sun, right? We make cholecalciferol, ultraviolet B rays touch our skin. And then there's a cholesterol known as 7-dehydrocholesterol that transforms that into cholecalciferol, right? Which is the vitamin D that you buy at the supermarket or at the pharmacy where you're able to buy it, right? And then this vitamin D is transported all the way to the liver. And in our liver, we have an enzyme that's upregulated by a gene known as CYP2R1. And this enzyme is known as 25-hydroxylase, which converts cholecalciferol into calcifidiol, or also known as 25-hydroxyvitamin D, right? Which is basically our reservoir of vitamin D in our body and has a half-life of approximately 2 to 3 weeks, right? It's kind of like our storage, okay? It's our reserve of vitamin D. Then this vitamin D metabolite, calcifidiol, goes down to the kidneys. And bear in mind that I'm only explaining just the endocrine pathway because there are many other pathways, okay? So this guy goes all the way to the kidneys, and if your kidneys are working just fine, right? They have an enzyme over there known as 125 hydroxylase, which converts calcifidiol into the actual hormone known as calcitriol. Now, calcitriol has a half-life of only 2 to 4 hours, and that's it. So it's a very short half-life. Cholecalciferol, the one that's made in our skin, has a half-life of 24 hours. Calcifidol has a half-life of 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And calcitriol has a half-life of 2 to 4 hours, depending on the literature that you're looking at. So in order for us to be able to make vitamin D, we need to be exposing ourselves on a daily basis to the sun or taking vitamin D on a daily basis. Why? It's because if we don't do that, and I know people that take like high load doses of vitamin D once a month, that's not pretty good. Actually, there have been studies that link that with, osteoporosis, This is why you need to be taking it constantly, and you need certain cofactors to keep it nice and at good levels. But what I'm trying to get at is this. The enzymes that participate in the conversion of vitamin D from one metabolite to the other are affected when you have excess amount of lipopolysaccharides circulating in the body, because they can go to these genes and they tell them, hey, turn off, or it makes the gene not work effectively. And that compromises your conversion of vitamin D. So in other words, it can lead to vitamin D deficiency. And the way how this is done is through the NF-kappa B pathway that I just discussed right over here. So that's mind-blowing right there, All these infections, chronic infections, right? Because I look at it as that, and we have to always remember, whenever I see a patient that has an autoimmune disease, I'm thinking infection at the back of my mind, There's a bug out there that's causing this. There's dysbiosis in the intestine, and there's inflammation in the intestine, and this patient has his immune system compromised. And that's when I start.
So not enough to put them in the intensive care unit, but enough that there is a low-grade constant state of inflammation. And I guess, if we start talking about migraine and cluster headache, there was a paper, and there's not a lot of research in this space that I was able to find looking at some of those markers like LPS in relation to migraine. It seems has kind of got the spotlight because it's more prevalent to say there's a paper saying lipopolysaccharide levels are elevated in the systemic circulation in chronic migraine patients with overuse headache, evidence of leaky gut and inflammation. And so my question to you then is, if we are talking about dysbiosis, the leakage of endotoxins, exotoxins, mycotoxins into circulation, then interacting with the immune system and upregulating the NF-kappa B transcription factor, which results in the production and expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines that are not limited to the gut but travel in systemic circulation, may be setting the stage then for hypothalamic dysfunction. Because if you look at imaging studies with cluster headache patients, the hypothalamus is all lit up, and something leads to that kind of sensitization to the point where the sufferer is more prone to cluster headache. And then my kind of follow-up question to that to say, in terms of, and you mentioned a bolus and a loading dose. So the cluster headache sufferer that is suffering today that stumbles across vitamindregimen.com and says, okay, I'm going to try this approach, is recommended to take a bolus dose of 600,000 international units. That's a lot of vitamin D at one time, and then to drop down to 10,000 international units to maintain serum in that kind of 80 to 100 nanogram per milliliter range. And so what are we kind of, my suspicion, particularly on the back of my experience of, I said I have been pain-free by and large 10 years, but it wasn't until 2022 where I came into cluster headache cycle and bang, I've got attacks. And I tell you, Dr. Beltran, I called Pete Batchelor, the retired near on 80-year-old fighter pilot that came up with the vitamin D regimen for cluster. And I said, Pete, Pete, my vitamin D level was 99.3 nanograms per milliliter, and I've just had a cluster headache attack. They're back. What do I do? The phone goes, the phone goes quiet, and he says to me, take 600,000 international units of vitamin D. I said, Pete, your hearing must be going in your old age. My level is already 100 nanograms per milliliter, and the attacks, and even more calm, he says, take 1 million international units of vitamin D3. And at that point, I decided to, and I started loading at 100,000 international units per day. And on day number 4, the cluster headache went back into remission. And so
that's right.
In terms of vitamin D resistance and the reasons for vitamin D resistance, what I'm taking away from this is that LPS may have, and the pathway that it induces may have quite the bearing on the situation. Would that kind of be fair?
Well, it's a very complex answer that I'm going to give you right now, but I'm going to give you the full answer, okay? Because I think your viewers deserve that, okay? And this is really interesting because we kind of have to remember where the high loading dose came from, the history of where that came from, because this goes all the way back, to when we had children that had rickets, right? So we had children, back in the 1800s, late 1800s, that were diagnosed with rickets, and we started giving them, 600,000 international units of vitamin D to quickly elevate the vitamin D levels. It's a correcting dose, okay? It's not a toxic dose. Vitamin D is extremely safe. I would like to go ahead and say that to all your listeners. It's very, very rare to cause toxicity with vitamin D, even at very high doses, because I've seen over 3,500 patients so far, and I've had no cases of toxicity. And if I did see a little bit of an elevation to vitamin D, to calcium levels, because that's what defines toxicity, is having hypercalcemia. It's just a matter of just reducing the dose and then monitoring the patient, and it should be fixed in about a matter of 3 days. But going back to what I was saying, so this whole high loading dose that we give to our patients, the intention is to be able to increase vitamin D to a certain level very quickly in a matter of about 2 to 3 days, right? Now, the thing is that the reasons why we have vitamin D resistance, it can be attributed to many different things. It can be obesity. We know that people that are obese, they have higher requirements of vitamin D. It might be caused by medications. If you're taking an immune, for instance, a corticosteroid, right? Like prednisone, right? Or hydrocortisone. Or you've been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and your rheumatologist is prescribing a steroid for you, we know that steroids upregulate an enzyme known as 24-hydroxylase, which eventually ends up degrading calcitriol. So this decreases your calcitriol levels in the blood, right? Then we have medications, people who have epilepsy. If they're taking carbamazepine inhibits CYP2R1. So in other words, you're not going to be converting vitamin D, and it's going to cause vitamin D deficiency. I mean, I could go on with drugs that alter and inhibit and cause decrease in vitamin D deficiency. But then we have another component with this genetic component, right? Which are the famous single nucleotide polymorphisms, right? And these single nucleotide polymorphisms are very common in individuals who have autoimmunity. Okay. I would say close to 80% of these individuals have, vitamin D genes that might have some single nucleotide polymorphisms. Some might have more, some might have less. Okay. And when I refer to the vitamin D genes, I'm referring to a group of genes. Okay. And genes that transport vitamin D, genes that convert one metabolite to the other, right? Genes that are regarding to the vitamin D receptor exclusively, you see? So we can have genetic polymorphisms that affect the transportation, right? The conversion, or the actual receptor itself, okay? And these things must be taken into account when you look at any patient who has a possible vitamin D resistance that is attributed to a genetic problem, right? And there are ways to be able to diagnose this. You can do genetic testing and look for these genes, right? And not only vitamin D, but you can also, it's important to look at other genes, for instance, like that are responsible with the methylation cycle, such as MTHFR, or genes that are responsible with liver detox, such as GST or GXT, right? These are very important for glutathione pathway. And let's not forget that glutathione is extremely important for our liver to be able to eliminate toxins. And every time you take Tylenol, for instance, which I know a lot of people who have cluster headaches are taking a lot of it, at one time in their lives, because they have a headache, right? So they might be taking, Tylenol because it's the only thing that's available for them. But every time you take Tylenol, you deplete your glutathione, you see? So these drugs can be harmful and make things worse even down the road. But going back to the vitamin D resistance and the vitamin D genetic polymorphisms, so there's a genetic component to it, right? There are medications, obesity, genetics, and now what I'm bringing to the table, and that what me and what some of my colleagues are bringing to the table, is there is a microbiome component to it. There's a leaky gut syndrome component to it. And this leaky gut syndrome, if it's not in check, it's going to contribute to the downregulation of the vitamin D receptors, and inclusively, to a certain extent, not very much, but to a certain extent, it can actually compromise the conversion of one metabolite to the other. You see? So when we talk about, cluster headaches or any type of disease, right? And yes, vitamin D, one of the reasons why vitamin D is so important, this is what I wanted to hit on. When you increase your vitamin D and increase the amounts of high amounts, it does a lot of good for you at the level of your immune system. It acts on your macrophages, your antigen presenting cells, and these cells make what we call beta defensins and catalysidins. And these guys they're going to go kill all these bad bacteria that are in your gut. So now you're actually equipping your immune system with the correct amount of vitamin D that they really need to be able to fight off the infection. And not only that, but calcitriol, the actual hormone of vitamin D, inhibits the production of zonulin. So if you are inhibiting zonulin, now you're preserving the tight junctions. This means that vitamin D reduces leaky gut.
Yeah,
that's why it's so good.
There's a really good paper that I was reading. Anyone can search. I'll put it in the description. But it was gliadin versus vitamin D3, a battle to the last tight junction, whereby
that's right. That's a great paper, by the way.
and it's a beautiful, beautiful paper. So just humor me. Let's just sidestep and go. I'm sitting at the table, the Last Supper, and I'm passed a loaf of bread. We've been eating bread. We've been eating bread and gluten for a long, long time. How can it really be bad for us?
Exactly. Well, it's because if you go to Europe, right, and you buy a loaf of bread over there in Italy, right, and you put a little bit of garlic and a little bit of butter, it's delicious, And I don't see people complaining that they're having issues with that type, unless you have celiac disease, obviously, right? Or you're gluten sensitive. But there are people that are eating bread and they have gluten, but the type of wheat that they have in those countries is an ancestral form of wheat. It's not the type of wheat that you have in the United States or in Latin America, or in perhaps some other countries as well, where it's been genetically modified. And it has been so much modified where you have 400 times more presence of gliadin and gluten in the molecule of gluten. So this means that you're getting a massive load of gliadin into your gut because it's been genetically modified. And then when you eat bread, let's say in the United States, then you say, oh, wait a second, this is not good, But if you eat bread, like let's say in some European country, and don't forget this is very important, they don't have herbicides, they don't have glyphosate in Italy. It's banned, right? So you're actually eating a healthier food over there, okay? And so that kind of explains why some people react less to wheat from Europe, and they react more to wheat that's coming from, let's say, the United States or any other country like South America, like Brazil, for instance, So that's one of the biggest issues right there. But then again, we have to step back and remember this. It's not just the gluten that's causing it. You might have certain dysbiosis that's promoting it. And if you have vitamin D deficiency as well, well, guess what? Your tight junctions might be just compromised. And then you're going to start getting the issues. So it's all about maintaining gut balance. It's all about having adequate levels of vitamin D and vitamin B12 and vitamin B9 and all these things, right? And making sure that we have a healthy lifestyle, good sleep. That's a big problem. We nowadays everybody's stuck on their phones before they go to bed. They're like zombies. And then we just get overwhelmed, and we just watch a movie, and we stay over really late at night. Sometimes we have difficulty falling asleep, or might be preoccupied with problems that we have in our work, or problems that we have in our family, or things that might be going on in our lives. And it just might be enough stress that just produces too much cortisol. And if you have too much cortisol, now what happens with your circadian rhythm? It's altered. And now that when we wake up, we start making cortisol, right? But as the day goes by and then the sun goes down, now melatonin starts to go up and cortisol starts to go down. That's the normal circadian rhythm right there. But if you're under stress 24/7, you're not going to get good night's sleep because your cortisol is always high, skyrocketing. You can't sleep. And if you go to sleep, it's going to be probably 3-4 hours sometimes. And then you get all this. You need to be drinking coffee to be awake at home when you're working. And you need to be on some medication to keep you, going because you're so tired. And then you get this adrenal fatigue. I mean, it starts building up. And I discussed this in my book. I mentioned these things about how important sleep is and making sure that you have all of your filters of your body, in check, right? So as you can see in that slide right over there, it says causes of vitamin D resistance. Well, obviously chronic infections. We talked about that. Obesity, medications, liver problems, kidney problems. Yeah, these are sites of conversion. And if we have, fatty liver, right, or renal insufficiency, I mean, we're not going to be able to, convert the metabolite adequately, right? And then we have the genetic component where we're talking about the single nucleotide polymorphisms. And then we can add on there the microbiome, which is also contributing to the problem. It's a big contributor. And then it's been under the radar of a lot of people. People haven't been looking at the microbiome as a contributor to vitamin D resistance. And that's been under my radar for a couple of years for me now, And this is why I wrote a paper. I wrote my book. I have articles talking about this, where I explain how these lipopolysaccharides, these endotoxins, these mycotoxins play a role in contributing to the whole vitamin D resistance thing, And it's something that's really interesting because it's been under the radar for many years, and a lot of people haven't even heard of this before,
It's super interesting. Should we freak the audience out and tell them what a biofilm is?
Yeah, sure. So biofilms exist, in our body all over. We have them on our skin sometimes. They can build it. They can start growing in our teeth. And people who know biofilms very well are dentists. I mean, every time you're going to your dentist and you're going to get your teeth cleaned out and they're taking that plaque out, well, guess what? That plaque is a biofilm, you see? It's a bunch of bacteria that, get together and they start making this biofilm, which is basically a extracellular matrix, right, of a substance that creates kind of like a shield that protects them from antibiotics. Okay. So interestingly, one of the things that I like to mention is that our microbiome is very diverse, right? In our gut, I'm talking about the gut microbiome. And whenever you have certain bugs that live in your mouth, like streptococcus, right? There's a bacteria in our mouth by the name of streptococcus mutans that causes cavities when we consume a lot of sugars. And we don't have the habit of brushing our teeth on a regular basis and using tooth floss. And that's how you end up developing, cavities. But these bacteria, we also have other bacteria, such as Fusobacterium nucleatum, which also is part of the oral microbiome. We have the oral microbiome, the nasal microbiome, the skin microbiome, the gut microbiome, the bladder microbiome. I mean, we have different microbiomes in different organs, you see? And this diversity changes on a constant basis. It's always changing, you know, if it's specifically if it's the gut. But what happens is, let's say you take a specific antibiotic, right? Like amoxicillin. And all of a sudden, all of these bugs, they say, oh, wait a second. This is no good. This is something that's not good for us. We're going to die out. So what they do, they start communicating with each other. And that's known by the name of quorum sensing. And they start, you know, gathering around. You can have here Clostridium, Escherichia coli, Salmonella, or any other bug, Klebsiella. And they start talking to each other. And they say, hey, you know what? We better get together here. You know, we better try to team up together, try to work together to be able to create this biofilm. It's kind of like a slime, I guess you could say, right? That creates a shield. And this shield, I'm trying to put it in layman's term for your audience here, by the way. So this shield protects them from antibiotics or anything that could probably potentially destroy them, you know? So then what happens is that over time, these microbes, let's say if you have a specific infection, right? And you have an autoimmunity that's ongoing then, and you start using conventional antibiotics, these antibiotics are not going to even touch the surface because they have this such a potent, resistant shield that protects them from all these antibiotics. So you need to start thinking, well, how can I actually eliminate these biofilms when they can actually be promoting leaky gut and causing this endotoxemia, causing these lipopolysaccharides to get in and induce a autoimmune disease, right? And here you can even mention candida that is interacting and communicating with bacteria. So you have a fungus, which is a totally different type of species that's communicating with bacteria, right? And these molecules that are being interchanged, you know, and there's a conversation that's taking place here between these guys, and this conversation ends up with the making of this biofilm. And it's kind of weird because you kind of have to think about it. Sometimes the disease that you have might have been started by candida. Okay, so if you have a patient that says, "Oh, you know what, Dr. Beltran, I have this issue of always having candida vaginal infections," you know, or a person says, "You know what, I've had these funguses on my nails for such a long time, you know, Dr. Beltran," or I might be having, you know, recurrent, you know, tinea cruris, which is the presence of candida on the skin by the inguinal region, you know, where you get this rash that is very itchy, and it's around this, you know, the scrotum of the vulva of the woman, and they have this fungal infection caused by candida. That's a sign of a compromised immune system, but also an overgrowth of a fungus. And sometimes when you treat these patients with antifungals, traditional antifungals, it kind of goes away, but you don't eradicate the infection completely. And the fungus, and then we know that bacteria and funguses have the capability of building up resistance to antibiotics, especially conventional antibiotics. And they intercommunicate with each other, and they start saying, hey, you know what? This antimicrobial, this antibiotic, and this antifungal that we just got hit massively with, we need to build up together and make this biofilm to be able to protect us. So that ends up happening. And then now the conventional medication that you took initially doesn't work anymore because you have a biofilm. So then this is the next thing I always tell patients. In order for you to be able to break these biofilms, you need to use what we call biofilm disruptors, right? And biofilm disruptors that I am very familiar with are a combination of certain herbals, such as oregano oil, berberine, licorice, curcumin. It's called garlic oil. These things, they have certain compounds in them that are very potent antibiotics. But I also add in sometimes, certain supplements like alpha lipoic acid or NAC and acetylcysteine, because they start making pores on these biofilms. And the more you start making more pores, it's like you're trying to drill in through this biofilm, drill in, drill in, drill in. And I use these herbals associated with these supplements like alpha lipoic acid in a series of cycles because you want to attack, 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 and then you want to give it a pause, and then attack again, attack again, attack again. You're going to give it a pause, and then attack again until you disrupt that biofilm, and then you're able to get those microbes. And the beauty about these herbals is that they've been around for thousands of years. We have so much information on these herbals, but we don't learn these things in medical school. They don't teach us these things because it's not conventional medicine. What medical schools are going to be teaching doctors are just everything that's related to pharmaceuticals. They're not going to be telling you, hey, whenever you see this, you could be using, oregano oil, right? Whenever you have candida or this or that, right? As a herbal. So doctors who work in the field of integrative functional medicine, unless you're a naturopathic doctor, well, then you will be receiving, education on herbals, obviously, because that's the naturopathic route, right? You kind of have to go back and restudy all of these things and learn. And that's what I had to do. I had to restudy all of these herbals. And then that's when I found that when you combine these herbals associated with alpha lipoic acid and NAC as well, you actually develop what we call biofilm disruptors. And then you break down the biofilm initially, and then you start targeting those those bacteria. And that can be appreciated in the GI map because when you do the GI map, you can actually say, oh, look, here we have 3 bad bugs that have been identified. For instance, you can find Escherichia coli, you can find Clostridium, and maybe even Morganella or Pseudomonas, 4, for instance, right? And then you treat the infection. And after then, about a month or so, or 2 months or so, you repeat the GI map, and then you see that there's been a decrease in the numbers of these microorganisms, but a new one just popped up that wasn't there in the first place. And then you say, but how come this guy just popped up? That's because he was way in the bottom of the biofilm. So there were like layers and layers and layers. So you see what I mean? So you actually were treating the surface, and the more you went down, eventually you got to the point where now this guy becomes evident, and you start seeing and detecting him on the GI map. And that's incredible because you start knowing now that you're actually getting in where you're supposed to. And that's how I treat my patients. And I use those 3 pillars of the LGS protocol which is first is modulation of the microbiome. And this is where the herbals go in, right? 2, modulation of the immune system. And that's where vitamin D comes in at high doses, according to the genetic profile of the patient as well. And 3, you have to compensate the epigenetics of every patient, because some people might have problems with the methylation cycle, and you need to compensate that methylation cycle. Some people have issues with detox, so you have to compensate the genes that are responsible with detox. Some patients who have autism have issues with neurotransmission. They have genes that require compensating in order to be able to produce more dopamine or reduce the excess amount of dopamine. And that's when we get to ADHD, autism, and all these things like that, which are described in my book, by the way. So the 3 major pillars of the LGS protocol, and now also treating cancer as well, is that you always have to remember that every patient who has a specific disease, autoimmune disease, metabolic syndrome, or cancer has 3 major problems going for them. They have problems with their microbiome, they have problems with their immune system, and their epigenetics are probably haywire that have not been compensated. So these are 3 major pillars of the protocol.
Mm-hmm. If I could, while we just stick around with the biofilm, you talk about pulsing. What is the idea around using the herbal antimicrobials in a kind of a pulse sort of fashion?
Oh, yeah. Well, the pulsing is really important because don't forget, these are also antibiotics, right? And if we use antibiotics for prolonged periods of time, you can eventually develop resistance to these antibiotics. So the pulsing is like you're treating the infection, you're doing them harm, and then you let it rest. And when you let it rest, you kind of allow the bacteria to kind of like recover a little bit, But then you start attacking them again, we get them by surprise. So this needs to be done in cycles, right? One, because you want to eliminate the infection progressively. You don't want to be doing it too harsh on the system as well. Second of all, there's a phenomenon known as die-off, okay? And a lot of patients who do herbals, when they're treating their patient, when you're treating patients with herbals and you start eliminating these biofilms or other bad bugs, these bugs, don't forget, inside of them, they have their toxins. And when they explode and they die, where does that go? It's going to go into your leaky gut that you have there in the first place. So we have to be cautious and not overwhelming the patient, making them, sicker, right? Because these toxins are going to eventually interact with the immune system. So this is why we do a 2-week cycle, and then we give them a break so they can recover as well. So you have to be a little bit conscious, So this is one of the many reasons why we do cycles. We treat the patients for 2 weeks, and then we give them 1 week of a break. They kind of recover. And I've had patients call me, Craig, where they say, Dr. Beltran, my psoriasis has gotten like full blown. Oh my God, it's terrible. This is terrible. I don't want to be taking these herbals. And I say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You're going to start taking activated charcoal, because activated charcoal, what it does, it binds to the gut epithelia, right? And it creates a thick layer that makes your intestines very impermeable. So in other words, you're physically using a physical mechanism by reducing the permeability of the gut, okay? And that way, you kind of reduce the excess amount of entrance of these lipopolysaccharides that are going to be interacting with your immune system. So there are many different reasons why we use, the cycles, and that's one of the few, right? So cycles, usually if you go to a naturopathic doctor and you're being prescribed a herbal, the usual route is that you're going to be prescribed it for about 2 weeks or so, 10 days, probably 15 days, and then you're going to have a 1-week break so you can recover. And then you start attacking again, and then you get these bad bugs, by surprise, and you start killing them even more until they're gone.
I'm laughing here because it's a story of my life that fly in the face of my doctor's advice, and then wing my own treatment. It's a perfect opportunity to talk to you about hidradenitis suppurativa.
Yeah.
So let me just give the background to the viewer. I would have gone through. I went to ask my doctor for the 6th round of antibiotics because they just got better, then just kept on coming back. And it was at doctor's appointment where the doctor had said to me, we can't. We're at the end of the road with the antibiotic, Craig. Look, I want to talk to you about a biologic and talk to me about this medication. I was like, whoa.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's when I followed much of the advice that I had garnered from the VDR renewal presentation to introduce quite a massive diet change for myself at the time, as well as I threw pretty much the kitchen sink at it in terms of herbal antimicrobials. And I did it for a month, actually, not 2 weeks. So disregarded the pulse therapy, but within 10 days, how is that even possible? I mean, I know it's possible, and I would say at the very beginning when I first saw my doctor about the condition, she had said to me, "It's a metabolic issue, Craig. You probably need to do something about your diet, and the condition will clear up." And I didn't want to listen at that stage, but so just talk to us a little bit about HS.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, I think what the problem is that when we go to our conventional doctor, our conventional allopathic doctor, and that's usually the medical schools around the world, the majority are allopathic, unless you go to a naturopathic doctor who's going to be talking about herbals at one point in life. Well, the thing is that they have not received training in microbiome interpretation. Okay. And some of them are not very familiar with the microbiome. And that's not their fault. It's because the system is set up to such a way where they're just going to be prescribing medications and antibiotics, and if that doesn't work, then they're going to be considering, biologics, et cetera, right? Like you said. And I'm going to be very honest with you, Craig. At one time, I'm an allopathic doctor. Okay. At one time in my life, I also was one of those doctors as well. You see, and I did prescribe antibiotics, and I did prescribe biologics as well, and immunosuppressive drugs. But then, like I said, like in the beginning of this podcast, I had things that happened to one of my family members, one of my children, and I had to start immersing myself in this whole new world, which was very eye-opening for me. It was very revealing, and that's how I ended up, discovering that the microbiome is the epicenter for human health, and that our epigenetics also has a very important role in how our biochemistry plays out and how our physiology plays out. And yes, the microbiome influences in how certain conditions like, hidradenitis suppurativa, can cause, abscesses in your armpits, or psoriasis can cause flare-ups, or vitiligo can show up, or hypothyroidism. And hypothyroidism also can be caused even through a root canal as well, just to give you an idea, So there's so many things that we as physicians are not aware of, and that we have to go back to school and study these things on our own. All right. Okay. Or do like this integrative. Now there are many courses in integrative medicine there, but these are courses that you have to pay out of your pocket money, to be able to learn these things from a specialist, people who actually learn these things, and are teaching them. It's like everybody's doing these things nowadays, but there's that other side of medicine. And I know colleagues that are very, narrow-minded, and they're very, critiques of you, and they say, that's just all, charlatanism. That's not, that's just rubbish. I don't believe what these guys are saying. Well, I feel very sad for that, because unfortunately, at one time in my life, I was kind of like them too, And then when you start getting this revelation, and you start seeing how things are really, and you do the science and you do the research and you look into it, and then you start saying, well, wait a second, this actually makes sense. This actually explains a lot of things, and the microbiome is definitely a point of the site where a lot of these things are happening. And yeah, the microbiota, the bad bacteria, when they start overgrowing and when they start causing all this inflammation, well, guess what? These are going to allow for, inflammation to take place in different sites of our body. And when you all of a sudden start fixing the microbiome, I'll give you this really interesting thing. For instance, our liver makes this enzyme by the name of beta glucuronidase. Beta glucuronidase. So this enzyme is very important because it causes glucuronidation, and it binds to toxins and certain hormones, like estrogen, for instance. And it takes it out via the gut pathway. It puts it out into the gut. But if you have certain bacteria that make the exact same enzyme, which is the beta glucuronidase that I just said, now they're going to get that toxin that's in the gut, or that hormone that's in the gut, and they're going to reintroduce it back into the hepatic system. So now you have this recycling, or better off saying reintroduction, this vicious cycle of toxemia, where the bad bugs are reintroducing the toxin into your body and causing this metabolic disturbance, like you just said. So it's important for us to be able to get our microbiome tested and look at our intestinal health markers, right? And these intestinal health markers, we're talking about steatocrit, secretory IgA, beta glucuronidase, anti-gliadin A, zonulin, calprotectin, the presence of occult blood that can be suggestive, of ulcers, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, even cancer, So these intestinal health markers are very important for us, and we have to know what they mean to be able to understand what's going on in our patient. And when we find what the bug is that's doing all of these things, then we can target them and perhaps even, treat them with herbals and diet, because diet is very important here, right? To be able to bring back eubiosis, the normal homeostasis. And when that happens, well, things start to play out the normal way, the way it's supposed to, right? We heal, right? So it's very complex, Craig, and it's fascinating because the microbiome, indeed, I always say, is the epicenter of human health. Anything that happens there, it's going to manifest in some other part of the body. It can be the skin, it can be the central nervous system, it can be in your bowels. I mean, you name it, it's going to show up somewhere.
So before we talk about then specifically your approach to kind of round off the conversation, I would just say, just as a segue to move into the LGS protocol, to touch on the Coimbra Protocol and to understand a little bit of the difference between the two. Suffice to say, in terms of psoriasis, one of the papers I had found, I don't know if you know of Dr. Renu Matani. She's a Coimbra trained protocol. A doctor had a case report. It was a series of 6 or 7 cases using the Coimbra approach, and the before and after photos of psoriasis patients were quite breathtaking. I will link that particular paper in the study. So when you approach Coimbra Protocol versus LGS Protocol, what are some of the core differences between the two? Because to my understanding, both of them are essentially the vitamin D regimen that I follow, but taken to the next level and done under the care and guidance of a physician, which leads me to the point that I was trying to make and wanting to kind of just posit the question to say that for the cluster headache sufferer that has either tried the regimen and found that they're one of the few that it doesn't work for, if they then went and kind of consulted someone like yourself and increased their vitamin D dosage to the point where they suppress their parathyroid hormone right down into the lowest point for normal reference, as well as adopting some of the I think you know where I'm going with it. I'll pass over to you.
Of course. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, there are some similarities and there are some major differences between the Coimbra Protocol and the LGS Protocol. The Coimbra Protocol, as we know, focuses in elevating vitamin D to certain levels where we are able to inhibit the parathyroid hormone without causing, obviously, toxicity. And this is why we measure, serum calcium or ionized calcium, making sure that the patient is not getting toxic. Now, and I think the dosage that they say is 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. That's what they recommend. My dosage is halfway. And the reason why is because of this. These are my findings. Whenever I treat a patient who has an autoimmune condition, and I do use high doses of vitamin D, but not to the extent of Coimbra, is because I have found in my patients that when you modulate very well the microbiome, let me put it this way. Let's say that you are taking 100,000 international units of vitamin D a day, and your PTH is around 15, 18-ish, okay? Closer to the lower reference values. And you're taking 100,000 international units a day, okay? And I've known people that even take 200,000. But anyways, so the thing is that, okay, Coimbra Protocol saturated those vitamin D receptors, and we know it's going to help those tight junctions. It's going to make beta defenses, catalycidins. It's going to start helping fight off the infection, and it gets better. And they also tell you, hey, you can't be drinking milk. You can't be consuming these foods because they're rich in calcium. And when you do that, we know that milk is pro-inflammatory, and we know that milk has casein. We know that milk has these things. So you're actually doing a little bit of anti-inflammation there too by taking out certain foods that are very rich in calcium, such as milk, right? So to a certain extent, that's good, right? But now what I've seen is that when you go the full anti-inflammatory diet, okay, and you detect what herbs are great to be able to target those bad bugs that you have in your gut, all of a sudden, when you decrease that permeability, what I've seen is that, let's say if I was taking 100,000, now my PTH goes below the reference value. And why is this? And I'll tell you why, or at least what I think why, right? It's because I have reduced the endotoxemia to such a point that the excess endotoxemia that was there initially has been lifted off and now has allowed for the vitamin D converting genes to be able to make more metabolites more efficiently. And two, you're allowing now for those vitamin D receptors to be expressed more than before, allowing for vitamin D to do what it was meant to do. And this is why you get this big shift now in inhibition excessively of the parathyroid hormone. So then say, whoa, okay, so that's too much now. And I don't need so much now. I can actually drop off the dose and then bring it over there to the lower reference values. So that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. It seems like an oxymoron to think I can grab a pizza for lunch, but as long as I kind of got my vitamin D on this hand, then I might be
I'm
okay.
protected. Let's go. I got vitamin D on board.
And the same too, to reference again that paper with vitamin D versus Gliadin, to say that why would you not kind of double up with a full approach, and the full approach in terms of what Pete Batchelor had come up with for the Sufra, that tries the base regimen, so that being vitamin D, magnesium, fish oil, a couple of other cofactors, and it doesn't work.
Yes, of course.
Time to try the full Monty. And what does the full Monty look like? It looks like adding in a range of other cofactors, many of which you use as part of your protocol. So what does a comprehensive approach look like, and why? Just help me to understand why the likes of the other proponents of like a carnivore diet, and like Jordan Peterson, for example, I've never seen him talk about it. He's a smart gentleman. And in his conversations about carnivore diet, I've never heard him start talking about the importance or the value of using a GI map. So what kind of value do you place in taking a GI map, and how does that guide your decision-making? So, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a very interesting question. And obviously, Jordan Peterson, he's very high. He's a very big proponent for the carnivore diet, and it does, in fact, help a lot of people, like I said before, but here's the thing. If you get a GI map of a person that's on carnivore, you might actually get improvements. And sometimes these people who are on carnivore diet, Craig, they do, slip in some fibers once in a bit. You can actually eat like avocados, and avocados are very rich in fiber and healthy fats as well, So you might be eating some veggies, very little, very to extent that it's mainly carnivore, but these fibers get in a little bit. That's one scenario. Another scenario, if let's say you're going full 100% carnivore, nothing that has fiber at all. Well, if you do that, you're literally taking out the food source that's causing these bad bugs to grow. Okay. And then by doing that, you reduce the inflammation. And also, don't forget, you're taking out the lectins that are found in these plants that many of these individuals have certain sensitivity to these toxins that are found in certain plants that are very rich in lectins. So just the fact of taking out these lectins and just eating meat, for instance, and eating fat, for instance, you're just helping out improving, the symptoms. But that does not mean that necessarily you fix the problem. That does not mean that the microbiome is 100% in check. That just means at least that you've reduced the load of the problem. And then if you do a microbiome test, and I say this because I've done many microbiome tests, a lot of GI maps. If I were to win a commission on every single GI map that I've set, I would be a millionaire by now. But anyways, going back. So when I look at people who have been on the carnivore diet, I find salmonella. I find Escherichia coli, enterohemorrhagic. I find Clostridium. And then they say, well, you're on carnivore. How long have you been on carnivore? Oh, 1 year, Dr. Beltran. It's like, oh, good. And how have you feel? I feel great. No. And then I start looking at the diversity, and I know that there's a lack in the diversity. And this is, and then the reason I asked them, but then why are you consulting with me if everything's good? Oh, it's because I want to optimize my microbiome. And I saw your videos and I started to follow you. Anyway, so going back to the main stem of the story is that when people find out that there's a test that can actually look at your microbiome and that you can actually create a protocol or a treatment plan through a specific type of diet that can optimize the microbiome, that's the moment when you say, oh, I didn't know that I could improve my bifidum bacteria, or I could improve my Akkermansia because it's absent, and I have patients that have had psoriasis and they have improved on the carnivore diet. And when I look at the GI map, there's no Akkermansia, you see? And if there's no Akkermansia, this means that this patient has taken away the lectin that was over-causing the inflammation, right? And has kind of improved the excess inflammation, but it's not perfected yet. There's still more you can do to make it better. And that's what people need to understand. And don't get me wrong, I'm not plant-based diet. I'm not for that. I believe that we have to have a diet that needs to be diverse. We need meat. It's very important. We're more Paleolithic people that live in a modern era, like Dr. Seyfried always says, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and the problem is that we live in an era where we just have so much sugar all over, And I think we need to be very moderate in what we're eating, and try to make sure that we're not overdoing our diet, eating too much of a carbohydrate, because that's where the carbohydrates are. They're in the plants, right? It's a plant-based diet that's rich in carbs. And then you start, unfortunately, going down this idea that being a vegetarian or a vegan 100% is going to be healthy. You can be healthy being a vegan as long as your microbiome is in check. You can be healthy being a vegetarian as long as your microbiome is in check. You can be a healthy carnivore as long as your microbiome is in check. And don't get me wrong, the microbiome is very flexible, Dr. Seyfried said once in a podcast that I had with him recently, well, the microbiome is different. For the person that lives in the desert has a different microbiome from the person who lives in the North Pole, right? The Eskimos, or a person that lives in the tropics in the Amazon. It's going to be different. Of course, it's going to be different. It's because the food availability is going to be different. But we always have to remember that wherever you go, human beings always try to make their diet the most diverse as possible. Okay? And if you go to the North Pole, we have the Eskimos over there. They eat a lot of meat, a lot of fat, but they eat a lot of seaweed as well. And seaweed is a source of fiber. If you go to the desert, the Sahara Desert, there's not a lot of food over there, but people are probably going to be eating, certain plants that have fiber, like the cactus. If you go to Mexico, they eat a lot of cactus over there. It's part of their diet. It's a lot of fiber in the cactus. So one way or another, we're going to be introducing a lot of fiber in our diet. As a matter of fact, studies have shown that people that have a high fiber diet are less prone to having colon cancer. So fiber is important. We can't minimize it. We can't minimize it.
It's interesting though. So okay, take that and flesh that a little bit more to say, pretty sure our Paleolithic ancestors didn't have a bowl and they were mixing mescaline and everything that was alive and fresh, and then eating it up, saying, "Bang, got the fiber." Because, and again, interested in your thoughts in and around the preparation techniques used for vegetables throughout the world. Often involves a lot of processes that change the food from when you pick it in nature to when you consume it. Like I've got a good Korean friend that makes amazing kimchi, right? And so, as an example, talk about fermentable foods. Does that form part of?
Well, fermentables, they're very good. They're very healthy because they are a source of probiotics. That's why So good. That's a great point, because here we go. A lot of people in different parts of the world have a tendency of fermenting their foods. And we have found that certain foods that are fermented are a source of certain good bacteria, such as lactobacillus, if you're consuming, let's say, yogurt, okay, or many other bacteria as well that are good, and they make small chain fatty acids. So if you're a regular consumer of fermented foods, meu amigo, as we say, in Spanish, mi amigo, you have fiber there. You're putting bacteria in there that are going to be colonizing. So these guys are actually going to be helping you out. And yes, fermentable foods are a good source of probiotics. They help colonize sometimes the bad bacteria that are missing, and they bring health. They bring health to ourselves. To the human body. I mean, the body itself benefits from the presence of good bacteria. They do a lot of good things for us.
So microbiome, GI map, what about the value of breath testing? So testing for methane and hydrogen, is that something that you would kind of do as standard practice? Or
yes, well, we have some people that have what we call SIBO, right? Which means small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So you have to kind of remember this. Okay, the large intestine is where 90% of our microbiome is located, and 10% is found in our small intestine. Okay, and we have a valve known as the ileocecal valve. This ileocecal valve is one directional, which means it goes from the small intestine and goes all the way to the large intestine. Right, so we process foods, we digest it, we absorb the nutrients, and then we excrete it to the large intestine. Some people sometimes, have an incompetent ileocecal valve, which allows for feces to accumulate in the large intestine, and all of a sudden starts bumping in and makes its way into the small intestine. And we have to remember that in the small intestine, we also have food that's being absorbed. And if 90% of these bacteria that were in the large intestine are now making their way into the small intestine and they find food, well, you are making a party. They're going to start procreating, and they're going to start dividing, and they're going to start growing. And sometimes we have certain bacteria, when they overgrow, these bacteria, once they get in contact with certain fibers or sugars, they ferment that and they make special types of gases, such as hydrogen. Some of these bacteria make methane, such as the archaeas. Archaeas are very ancient forms of bacteria, and they ferment as well, and they make methane. And methane, methane has this effect on the muscle, the smooth muscle of the intestines. It causes kind of like a paralysis. It decreases peristaltism. So people who have an overgrowth of certain bacteria that cause methane production are more prone to constipation. And people who have bacteria that are more hydrogen-producing bacteria, when they ferment the food and they make hydrogen, they cause more diarrhea. And there are some other bacteria that make what we know as hydrogen sulfide, which can cause both, either constipation and diarrhea sometimes. So having this said, in my book, I have created, what we call the SIBO Microbiome Concordance Index Score, where basically I do these breath tests that these patients who have SIBO, right, or EMO, if it's intestinal methanogenic overgrowth, right, if it's a bacteria that produces methane, right? So I measure these gases, and I can determine if it's a methane microorganism that's producing, or if it's hydrogen producing, or if it's hydrogen sulfide producing. And based on that, I'll be able to know what is the best herbal that I'll be able to use to be able to treat these. And then I'm going to correlate this test with the GI map to see if there is any bacteria that I see over here that is also overgrown, that is also either a methane producer, either a hydrogen producer, or a hydrogen sulfide producer. And I make that correlation. And when I find that correlation, I say, okay, so there is a bug that's also in the large intestine that's found in the small intestine that makes the same gas, right? And I ask questions to my patient. Well, tell me a little bit about your symptoms. And then he's, oh, I get bloating, I get diarrhea, I've got GERD, I've got, abdominal pain, I have a whole bunch of different symptoms that you can manifest. And there's like a checklist that you ask the patient, and then we compare that with the intestinal health markers. And there's a scoring system that's set up that has a maximum score of 50. And I add these points up together. I get the GI map or the microbiome test, correlate that with the SIBO breath test, correlate that with the symptoms of the patient, and correlate that with the intestinal health markers that are found in the GI map. And then I make a score. I create a score based on all that information. And then I start treating my patient. And then I repeat all of those tests. And I ask the questions again in regards to clinical improvement. And I compare the intestinal health markers. And then you start seeing a decrease in the number. And if you see a decrease in the number, in the score, the higher the score, the worse the patient. The lower the score, the better the patient. So if that score is going down, let's say if it was in 30 and now it's like in 15, that's a sign of improvement, right? So this is in my book. It's called the SIBO Microbiome Concordance Index Score. There's no one has ever done that. And if they're doing it, they're probably doing it without knowing, okay? But I developed that in order to help me as a physician to be able to monitor the progress in my patients. So this is what I know. This is what I've described as the SIBO Microbiome Concordance Index Score.
In terms of the front cover of your other book, doesn't look like keto. That's not keto. That ain't keto, folks.
That's keto. That's Keto Uncomplicated. That's what another book that I have. It's on Amazon. If you'd like to lose some weight, doing the ketogenic diet, it's a great diet. One of the things I love about the ketogenic diet is that it treats a whole bunch of things. And the reason why is because when you do ketogenic diet associated with the intermittent fasting or extended fasting or prolonged fasting, whichever way you want to say it, there are a series of things that happen in the microbiome. And one of those things is that if you're doing fasting, and I do this a lot for my cancer patients, especially, when you do fasting associated with a ketogenic diet, that's basically what we call metabolic therapy. Dr. Seyfried talks about this in his book, and he's a very big proponent of the ketogenic diet. But you can do a ketogenic diet with other diets as well. But the reason why I prefer doing ketogenic diets is because the ketogenic diet is 70% rich in fats, healthy fats, 20% rich in protein, and 10% carbohydrates, or almost no carbohydrates. And like I did mention before, when there's a lot of fats and a lot of protein that's getting into into your intestine, the bugs, they don't know what to do with the fats, and they kind of partially know what to do with the protein, but since they're not getting the carbohydrates, then they start to die off. And then you have the fasting component of it, where you can be doing a 16-hour fast with, or it depends on the type of fast you want to do, but you can do 16 hours. Some people do 24 hours. Some people do 3 days water fast with tea and some coffee, depends. But when you do the fasting, we've noticed that after 24 hours of fasting, you get reduction in bad bacteria, increase in good ones, they start going back. And then we have increase in stem cells. They're starting to show up, and they're going to start repairing the gut lining. And if you keep on insisting on that fasting for about 3 days, 72 hours, now these stem cells that were at the gut, now they start migrating and going to other tissues to be able to help repair, the skin or the brain or the heart or wherever that needs to go, right? So fasting has that beauty of helping the body heal, right? And obviously you make what we call ketones, right? Which is another energy fuel source for the brain, right? And cancer And just to finish this off, cancer cells, they feed off two things. They feed off glucose, right? Mainly glucose, and glutamine, which is the most abundant amino acid in the human body. When you take away sugar from the diet and you go on a ketogenic diet, well, in about 24 hours, your body is, has eliminated and consumed all of the glucose that was in the blood. And now your liver kicks in with glycogen, being able to transform that glycogen into sugar, into glucose. And that can last for about 2 to 3 days. And then once that's out, then you have to start making ketone bodies, beta hydroxybutyrate. And then you start burning fat to be able to transform that into ketones, right? Thanks to the liver, because the liver does that for you. And then the brain starts getting another fuel source, which is much more efficient than glucose, which is ketones. And this is why children who have epilepsy get much better when they are on the ketogenic diet. Because I always have a tendency of saying is that if you have a neuron that's not working very well, or areas of the brain that are not working very well, that's associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, which is also the same thing that happens in cancer as well. You see, our cells, we have a powerhouse known as the mitochondria. And these mitochondria are the ones that make ATP, which is the energy source for the cell. If these mitochondria are not working correctly, right, such as cancer cells in this case, they don't know what to do with oxygen, and they're going to start fermenting. They're going to start converting glucose into ATP. So they go into this fermentation state. And they can also use glutamine to be able to do that too. So this is the reason why the ketogenic diet eliminates sugar, eliminates carbohydrates, increasing the amount of ketones in the body, which is something that the cancer cell doesn't know what to do with, right? And it starts to die off by itself. And if we have to compare as a source of energy, if I would compare sugar, glucose, to beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body, the brain is always going to choose the ketone body because it's a very highly efficient fuel source. And don't forget, as Paleolithic men that we were once, we were always in nutritional ketosis. It's just the way that we live today. We just have so much abundance of, sugar around us. In every single corner, everywhere you go, it's coffee with sugar, tea with sugar, a soda pop, full sugar, bread, carbohydrate, unconfirmed sugar. I mean, we're bombarded on a daily basis. It's kind of hard to hide away from it, and we crave sugar. We love sugar. It's like a cocaine to us, we want it. It's kind of hard to say no. And sadly, that's been incorporated into our society, and we weren't meant to be like that.
One thing to round off this conversation, I just want to talk to you about. We talked a little bit about the vagus nerve and vagal tone, and that autonomic balance of the two kind of rest and repair, fight or flight systems. And so, I just want to talk to you about psychology a little bit here to say. You can have a fantastic diet, no gluten, sugar, dairy, low in lectins, really good plant fiber, clean, good protein. But if you grew up in an environment where it wasn't safe, where you had to fight for love and care, and you weren't raised in the kind of environment, then that suggests to me that your worldview may be one to say that, man, the world out there, it's a scary old place. And that worldview is kind of translated through our biology, is it not?
Oh, yeah.
And so at what point do I just go out the ghost to say, I could eat as healthy as anything. I could take as much vitamin D as Dr. Beltran is suggesting. But if I don't change the way I see the world and how stressed out I am or I am not, then it's all for nothing. We've got to actually engage in life and enjoy life and enjoy the quality of our social relationships and everything in between, because our environment as well contributes to everything's inflammatory. Ladies and gentlemen,
Everything. That's right. It's kind of hard, I mean, and yes, I'm 100% on board with what you said there, Craig. I mean, there are people, that have had a history of a very hard life, and they had to endure a lot of problems, a lot of things, and there's certain trauma that hasn't been, resolved yet. So, to those people, what can I say? Is that every patient that I see, I always ask a little bit about the history, what happened in their lives. You always have to be very, uh, you have to pay attention to the details because there's a lot of things that have probably not been, settled yet. And there's a lot of regret, sometimes a lot of anger, sometimes there might be a lot of sadness if somebody passed away or something. There could be so many mixed emotions, and it's important, I always say it's very important that we address these things with a very delicate approach. Why? Because as it is easy to set one off, uh, by saying something, you know, we have to be the most encouraging and allowing for these people to feel safe, allowing for these people to feel that they are in a place where they know that the best intentions are there for them and that we want them to strive and to be great in life. They want to succeed in life. And that's a very big challenge because you have to be a very good psychologist as well, and you need to know how to go around those issues in a very delicate manner because there are some things that people, they get very emotional, when we talk about it. And for other people, not as it might not be such of a bad thing. It might have been probably, they lost their job and there was a lot of stress. And then I said, well, guess what? You might have lost your job, but there's going to be another job in the corner over there. You can always get something, you can apply for another job, right? But there are certain things that are just unfortunately very deep within ourselves, within our soul. I always say, that hasn't been, it hasn't healed yet. So we need to do a lot of soul seeking and a lot of healing as well. And that's sometimes where I tell people, hey, you need to go to church. You need to talk to your pastor. You need to talk to the priest, to your priest that you have in your church. If you're a person of faith, that's a good thing. Go to talk to God. You need to have him in your life, accept Jesus Christ in your life, and obviously there are many different faiths out there, but I'll tell them, get closer to your in contact with your faith, right? That's very important, and if you need to make, healing, you need some healing done and you want to receive forgiveness or you want to receive, some, you need these things to be settled out. You need to go and ask for it, ask for forgiveness if that's what you need, or go and forgive whoever needs to be forgiven. You see, it's not easy. It's a very delicate thing, but you kind of have to be a psychologist and know how to go around it and use these things as tools to be able to help you, go to the next level. And once once you have settled these things in your own personal life, well, treating your diet, compensating your genes, taking vitamin D, all the things that we have discussed today seems to be much easier, and you feel more in tune with it, So it's very important to treat the mind as well. The mind is a very complex organ. We have our unconscious, the subconscious, and then we have the consciousness, And
I thank you for sharing that presentation with me. The gentleman with the very thick, is it Sri Lankan?
Dr. Najib, he's a genius. I love the guy. I love him very much. And he's gone through a lot of hardship, His wife has passed away and his son has passed away, but he's still a very resilient man, And he has changed the lives of so many doctors.
He talks a lot about hope in that presentation, and I think it's incredibly important. And in fact, I'm really glad that we kind of rounded off this conversation with that element to say that there is no disconnect between our physiology and our psychology. It does go hand in hand, and when you're feeling good and when you're giving praise to whatever it is that you are giving praise to, it's the same physiological response of having hope.
Most definitely.
Man, it's a beautiful world out there. And hey, like
Yeah.
I saw that you had watched a little bit of my podcast and around that fatherlessness piece. And yes, it has affected me. And yes, it had a profound impact on the trajectory and journey that I've taken in life. But I also realize through all that hardship and diversity that for all the bad stuff in the world, it's an incredibly beautiful world as well. And there's so much
Yeah.
to give thanks for, and that's so important.
Of course, yes. I think we all, even doctors, even we, I mean, we're human beings as well. We have our ups and downs. And I'll tell you one thing, at the beginning of my career, when I was doing my first, on-call shift as an emergency doctor, and I didn't have too much experience. And I was like, oh my goodness, I would like in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Hopefully no one dies on my shift today, But I was starting off and I was so overwhelmed and so scared and so afraid of something, that I wasn't going to be enough, to be able to help out my patients. But um, I think one of the things that always kept me, in check is that I am a person that has a strong faith in God, and I have the support of my wife, and she was always there with me, making sure that, she would back me up, right? And in the good times and in the bad times. And it's important to have a support system, So it's good to have someone that you can count on and who you can tell your problems and you can tell your sadness and even share your happiness with them, which I think is the most important thing. And our friendships are friends, it's important to us to have friends who we can go and, relate to and talk to and sit down, and if you want, you can't, there's some things that are just very personal that you can't speak sometimes with your wife. You can go out and talk to your friend about it, And so these things are very important. The inner circle that we create in our lives is very important, and we have to know how to choose the right friends,
If people want to know a little bit more about you and to follow some of your work, what would you recommend?
Well, if you'd like to go ahead a little bit, read my book, The LGS Protocol,
Yep.
An epigenetic solution for treating autoimmune diseases. There you go. You can go ahead and follow me on my channel, The LGS Protocol, on YouTube. I also have a website. It's www.spims.org. You'll be able to find a little bit of information in regards to what the LGS protocol is, metabolic therapy. There are some articles that I've written are also there, some videos as well. And to be able to finish off with what I have to say, I guess I always say that our epigenetics, always is governed, by the nutrients and the food that you give it, So your genes are always going to be thanking you what you're feeding them. But also, don't forget, the microbiome does exactly the same. So if you give them what they need, your biochemistry is going to find the resources for natural healing. So make sure that you eat well, and nourish your body how it's supposed to be.
Dr. Beltran, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Craig, for having me. It was a pleasure.
It's been a hot minute since I had my conversation with Eduardo. I've done the editing. You've watched the show. I thank you for your time and for checking it out. If you've got any comments or suggestions, I'm always looking to improve. So drop those below, along with liking the video and subscribing to the channel. If you've got questions for Eduardo, I'm fairly certain that that he would be happy to take those on, whether we covered them in a follow-up podcast or publish them on my blog over at vitamindregimen.com. Like and subscribe to his channels, and you'll find a link to his website in the description below. And until next time, there will be more content coming. But in the meantime, you're very welcome to check out my personal podcast about how I treated my cluster headache with vitamin D. And I do have some other podcasts as well that may be of interest to you. Until next time, take care. Talk soon. Craig Stewart, Inspired Conversations.